Good morning. Welcome to the Point. In Washington this week, once again, we started to hear the rancor over the Affordable Care Act. Republicans who say they want to repeal it, Democrats who say it needs to be improved, and there's really no meeting in the middle, at least not yet. This comes just over a week after a shooting before a congressional baseball game had brought conversations about bipartisanship. We sat down with U.S. Senator Gary Peters to talk about what's going on with the Affordable Care Act, the impact that the shooting of the congressman and others had just before that baseball game, and we talk about a special trip he took that involves Michigan fighting men and women. Senator, let's talk about health care. The Republicans have come up with what I would call more of a draft that they're talking about. Your reaction, your fellow Democrats' reactions was, this is not a plan. This is not something that you can get behind. So first, tell me what your thoughts are on seeing at least the outline of what they're thinking.
Well, it's still right. I did just see the outline, so I want to take some time to do a deep dive. Obviously, this is something of critical importance to Americans. There isn't really anything more important than your own personal health care and the health care for your family. So I want to make sure we are doing it right, making sure everybody has access to quality, affordable health care. I certainly was not pleased with what came out of the House. In fact, with the Congressional Budget Office showing that in excess of 20 million people would lose health care coverage. Older Americans would actually see large increases in their premiums, and people without, or with, I should say, pre-existing conditions would not possibly be able to get insurance. And it looks like all that is in the Senate version as well. So I'm very troubled by that. I think if you look at the repeal of some of the Medicaid expansion, which has been so important here in Michigan, with hundreds of thousands of people now with health care coverage when they didn't get it before, that's going to be phased out. It's going to be a little longer under the Senate version, but nevertheless, the result is the same. It's troubling in the fact that people with pre-existing conditions, which I think is one of the most important aspects of the Affordable Care Act, is that you could still get insurance even if you had a pre-existing condition. In this new version, it looks as if you might be able to get insurance, but you simply won't be able to afford it. And the costs are going to go up dramatically. And in my mind, that's not insurance.
You've been around Washington. You've been around the legislative process a long time. Republicans and Democrats have a fundamentally different view about the Affordable Care Act. There are some Republicans, Rand Paul, others, who aren't going to vote for anything that doesn't repeal the Affordable Care Act. There are some Republicans, like Susan Collins, who won't vote for anything that does repeal the Affordable Care Act. Leaving Democrat votes on the side, because right now there's not a single Democrat vote for any of the plans that have been put forward so far in Washington, is there a realistic possibility that anything changes with health care?
I don't know, but I hope that we can come together in a bipartisan way. To me, that's the way we make this process work better. And it's been a source of constant frustration to me in the fact that I would hope that we would all be united in a bipartisan way, in the belief that everybody in this country, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, should have access to quality, affordable, and that's the focus, affordable health care. To me, we can do that. Other countries around the world do it. We should be able to do it here as well. I think the Affordable Care Act took us down that road. It's not perfect, but I've never voted on a perfect bill in my life. I don't think I ever will have a chance to vote on a perfect bill. They don't exist. So we should celebrate what works, go back and fix things that aren't really working that well, but be focused on the end goal, which is to make sure everybody has access to affordable care. And that's not what we're seeing in the Senate version. It's certainly not what we saw in the House Republican version. If we can get to that, I think you could build a consensus of Democrats and Republicans somewhere around the center of folks who are practical, common sense problem solvers saying, we have a problem here. Let's fix it. Let's take party labels out of it. Let's stop fighting this thing based on politics and think about the people that we serve.
It was, however, born in politics. It was all Democrats who voted for the Affordable Care Act in the first place, and Republicans, it occurs to me from the outside looking in, if they can't get a bill that does something to fundamentally change the Affordable Care Act, they're likely to do nothing.
Well, it may. I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens when the final version comes out of the Senate. We'll see how open the process is. The process has not been open to this point. This has basically been drafted in secrecy. It was just released. In fact, it was interesting. One of the 13 members of the Republican study group who was supposedly writing the bill actually came out publicly and said He never saw it until everybody else did. He was not involved in the process. And that's someone who was in the work group. So obviously that work group wasn't working. This was crafted by a few individuals in secrecy. That's not the way the process should work. We should have hearings. We should have doctors and physicians and patients and nurses, folks that are coming together to say, how's this going to impact us? When you're dealing with such a large amount of the U.S. economy, which is healthcare, not to have an open process to me is irresponsible.
I want to juxtapose that against something that happened the week prior. And the week prior, a number of Republicans were practicing for the congressional baseball outing. They were fired upon by a man who was later himself killed. The prognosis, I think, for the congressman that's injured is better on a daily basis. But there was that moment. It was that big that we heard about bipartisanship and about people saying nice things about each other. Fast forward a week later, and the healthcare conversation has once again created all the rancor that is Washington. What was the mood in Washington on the day of that shooting?
Well, certainly it was somber, and people were shocked by that, and certainly our heart went out to everybody who was injured. But unfortunately, we see incidents like that not just with members of Congress and their staffs. We see it all across the country, that we have either terrorist acts or just extreme acts of violence that are for whatever reason. We're seeing it too frequently in this country. We have to be able to try to deal with this issue and come together as a country. And when you mentioned your question about the politics, to me, we should never do anything that leads someone to think that they should take violent action against someone who they may not agree with. The democratic process works when we disagree with each other, but you do it in a civil fashion, that you don't take it personally. I have different policy views than my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but I respect them, and I consider many of them friends of mine as well. But we may have policy differences, but it should never, ever evolve to the point where someone thinks violence is the answer.
There used to be kind of an unwritten rule in Washington that you could disagree without being disagreeable, but that seems to, at least at some point, not be invoked very often, because there is a lot of superheated rhetoric. How much of a responsibility, and you and I have had this conversation over the years, but how much of a responsibility do you think members of Congress have maybe to, without cameras on, go into that, in your case, your Republican colleague, and say, hey, let's do this conversation, but let's do it without all of the extras. Let's talk about the facts and not try to gin up all of the emotion.
Well, and I want to say that does happen. I mean, we do work on a bipartisan way. I'm working right now on a bill for for autonomous vehicles, which is the next big thing for the auto industry. And I'm actually working with Senator Thune, who is the Republican chair of the Commerce Committee, which I sit on. The two of us have been working hand in glove. Our staffs have been working together. Our staffs have had over 100 meetings with stakeholders. So we're going to come out with comprehensive legislation, hopefully in the next few weeks. And that's a bipartisan piece of legislation because of that relationship. I worked with Senator Gardner, a Republican from Colorado, to pass the American Innovation Act. So, I pride myself on those relationships. I consider folks on the other side of the aisle my friends. Recently working on a missile defense bill with Dan Sullivan, a Republican out of Alaska, to hopefully make sure that Fort Custer becomes a missile defense site. That's something that I'm doing on a bipartisan basis. So I always believe that the only way you can get to real good policy is by reaching across the aisle and finding common ground.
I want to move on to the autonomous vehicle thing in just a moment, but before we leave this issue, one more incident of violence that happened in Flint this past week. We now know, according to the FBI, that the individual who was involved is from Tunisia by way of Canada, came into this country and proclaimed to hate America, apparently, in one of their interviews. And again, it's one of those, I don't know if I like the phrase, but it is a lone wolf attack. Apparently, he acted alone. It's very hard, isn't it, for us to defend ourselves against something like that?
Well, it is. It's the kinds of things that keep you up at night. And I serve on the Homeland Security Committee in addition to Armed Services, so national security issues are always at the forefront of my mind, and particularly when it comes to the homeland. And all you can do is do the best you can to prepare. You try to use intelligence to try to intercept coordinated activities, particularly if those are terrorist organizations that are doing it. But when you have one individual, as we had in this case, who harbors some hate and acts on that hate, it's difficult. But we need to put the kinds of security procedures in place to try to minimize that. So I think one thing that we've seen with this airport incident, which happened outside of what they call the sanitized areas before you go through TSA screening, is that we are seeing increased attacks in those areas because you've got people that are congregating before they get onto their airplane. I think we need to be looking at enhancements in infrastructure in order to protect individuals in that environment. So barriers, for example, for automobiles or vehicles that could be run into a crowd of people. We need to have an armed presence of security folks. And a lot of that depends obviously on the airport, and every airport's going to be different as terms of their security needs. But it certainly has elevated the need to understand that we can't think just about the sanitized area of an airport. It's got to be in the areas around the perimeter as well.
Let's move on to something that is somewhat more pleasurable to talk about, and that is the autonomous vehicle bill that you said you're working on with Senator Thune. This is such a big deal because it is real. It is happening now. The University of Michigan is going to use driverless vehicles as shuttles on their campus beginning this fall, and I've seen those things, and they're remarkable. They were developed down at M-City, where I know you have been and where I've taken a tour, and now we've got the Ypsilanti facility that's going to be up. This is fundamental for what we are now referring to as the mobility industry here in Michigan.
Well, it is, and it's going to change so much. This is the most transformative, and you can also say disruptive technology since the first car came off of the assembly line. I mean, it's that big for the auto industry. And it's also that big for our society. Just like when that car came off the assembly line, you think about the transformation of American culture, of American society. It created the American middle class. You can go through all of the really seismic changes that occurred. The same thing will happen now with autonomous vehicles. And I'll say one of the most exciting things about self-driving cars are the safety features. We believe that when you eliminate human error, which is responsible for most car accidents, these systems could very well eliminate most car accidents. And when you consider the fact that 40,000 people die on our highway every year, that's a big deal, not to mention all the other injuries and problems associated with it. So it's great promise, and I want to make sure that it's in Michigan, and Michigan is the center of the universe when it comes to self-driving cars. I'm happy to say that we're now seeing the big tech companies come into Michigan because they realize this is the place to be. So if you're Google, if you're Microsoft, if you're Cisco or NVIDIA, they're all moving their or some of their operations here, which is going to be very important.
So what you and Senator Thune are working on would do what? What would this bill do?
Well, it creates a space to allow innovation to go forward. The automobiles are heavily regulated from a safety perspective, as they should be, and we got to keep people safe. But if you look at the regulations, they're very specific. For example, they say a car must have a steering wheel, and it has to have A through Z. It must have a brake pedal, an A through Z. Well, self-driving cars won't have a steering wheel, they won't have a brake pedal, because there's not a human being in charge. And so that means a complete rewrite. But as you're completely rewriting regulations, you need to have data. You have to understand how these vehicles work. There's a lot that goes into it. But in the meantime, you don't want to stifle innovation. You want to get these cars both at the M-City as well as American Center for Mobility, but you also got to get them on our public highways and streets to really test them and see how they work. And so this legislation gives that space for that innovation to occur while still being obviously concerned about safety.
I think that there is a certain fear factor for some folks when they think about vehicles that are driverless, and that's not the next step. The next step really is about connectivity, so vehicles can communicate back and forth. So if you're 4 car lengths ahead of me and 2 cars are in between us, and you apply your brakes in a panic mode, perhaps your car could tell my car so I don't end up rear-ending the 2 cars in between us. I mean, it starts with really things like that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, we're not going right to self-driving cars. There's an evolution there. And in the meantime, as that evolution goes forward, our automobiles become safer and safer. The example you have, I mean, to think that your automobile will know what's happening 2 or 3 car lengths ahead, so you don't get the kind of multiple crashes where everybody's piling into each other, that could be avoided. You can keep automobiles in their lane. In fact, most fatalities occur because a car actually leaves its lane. If you apply automatic braking and just keep an automobile in the lane, folks are likely to survive any kind of accident, especially with airbags and the like. So these are improvements that will enhance safety dramatically and lead us down to the path where eventually they can drive themselves.
And we should point out that that technology that you just spoke of is included on many of today's cars already.
It is, and it's going to be on more and more cars and they're getting more experience out on the road. They're testing them. So some of the LiDAR and cameras, the vehicle-to-vehicle communication systems, all that stuff is being used real world on the streets today. And it's a cumulative process. It all builds together. Then you put the package together and you have a self-driving vehicle.
When we come back, we'll talk with Senator Peters about a recent trip he took to Latvia and what it has to do with members of the National Guard and the Air Guard from right here in Michigan. It's next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point, talking with U.S. Senator Gary Peters about a number of issues, including one that you may not have known about. It certainly took me by surprise. Over a quarter of a century for the National Guard from Michigan to train with soldiers from Latvia. The senator just got back from a trip to observe that training. We talk about that. Let's talk about a recent trip that you took. They are sometimes referred to as CODELs, where you have a congressional delegation. I understand you went as a delegation of one.
Yeah, that's right.
To something that, and I always love this. Part of this job that I like the most is when you learn something. And in talking with some of your staff, this is a program that's been going on since before I started covering politics at this television station, where we exchange knowledge as well as take our troops and they bring their troops between the state of Michigan and Latvia. Latvia, which is of strategic importance, you said.
The tip of the spear.
Tip of the spear, right. I mean, it really is a critical location on the map, but this is something that's been going on for a long time. So let's take time and explain this in long form, because this is something that up to now I had frankly never heard of.
Yes, and I think we should all be proud as Michiganders that the Michigan National Guard has had a long-term partnership with the country of Latvia, an exchange program with our military to train and to equip Latvians to work together. In fact, it's one of the first partnerships ever created 25 years ago. Since that time, we've got a number of partnerships with countries around the world. But what it means is that members of the Michigan National Guard and the Air Guard travel to Latvia. They participate in exercises. That's what I saw last weekend on my trip to be with guardsmen as they were training. They also train on a regular basis. In fact, recently I was up in Alpena at the training facility up there, and there were a number of Latvian soldiers in Michigan training here in our state as well. And I will tell you, the Latvians love the Michigan National Guard, and they love it because they are concerned. As you mentioned, they're in the middle of a potential storm on the border with Russia. They are very fearful of the Russian aggression they're seeing throughout Europe, from the illegal annexation of Crimea to the fighting that's occurring in the Ukraine. This fall, in September, the Russians are going to engage in a military exercise along the border of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, with over 100,000 Russian troops just across the border. And those are small countries. If you come across the border, you can be in the capital city in a matter of hours. So they are very concerned. And these are countries that have lived under Nazi occupation. They've lived under the Soviet Union occupation. They know how important their independence and freedom is, and they know how it can be taken away. And having the reassurance of having American soldiers like the Michigan National Guard there means the world to them.
And as you say, they come here and train as well, but let's move ahead a little bit to that big Russian exercise. If it is just that, it is still somewhat provocative for these small countries. If you have 100,000, I mean, Latvia can't have anywhere near that kind of manpower. So just in the physical presence alone, is there a sense, did you get the sense from people in that region that they think the expansionism of Russia is an inevitability that they're going to try?
Well, they're very worried, because it's not just the exercise, as provocative as that is. They are subjected to constant cyber attacks. And we saw what the Russians did in our election. We know what the Russians do on a daily basis when it comes to stealing money from Americans and criminal enterprises. All that's happening constantly in the Baltic states as well. You talk about fake news, Russian fake news. They are bombarded by that. In fact, one of the places that I visited in Latvia was Stratcom, Strategic Communications for NATO. And NATO is trying to push back on the fake information that the Russians are constantly putting into those countries. In fact, when I was there, they were putting out a story that an American bomber had blown up a building in Lithuania. And it wasn't. There was a picture of a burning building, but there was no real burning building. There was no bomb drop. But on social media, they were pushing around the story that having the Americans in these Baltic countries is dangerous. That's the message that the Russians wanted to send. The Americans, it was a mixed message. The Americans aren't going to be there to defend you if you need defense, and they're dangerous. Look at, they're blowing up a building in your country. So they are constantly being fed this kind of really pretty aggressive cyber and fake news attacks. And you combine that with amassing of troops, they have reasons to be concerned. So we've been working to put more resources into that area. We have American troops in Poland. The Canadians are actually in Latvia. We've got the Lithuanians have Germans, and up in Estonia are the UK. So NATO is there. We have a presence. We have people on the ground. And we certainly hope that's a deterrent to the Russians to know that if you do come across the border, you're immediately going to meet NATO troops.
I am reminded as you talk about fake news being used in a way that because of social media, it's very easy to do. And because of the way people consume social media, it's perhaps easier to get people to believe those stories. But what you're really talking about is psychological warfare, which is something that we've seen for decades, from World War II to Korea to Vietnam. I mean, that's always part of a military activity, but the social media aspect really ramps it up, doesn't it?
Well, it does, and that's what it is. It isn't different. As you say, psychological warfare has been with us, but it's different dropping leaflets out of an airplane flying over as opposed to being in the leverage of social media. I mean, if you look at statistics that I've seen, over half the people in this country get their news from Facebook. And so you have to be a very critical consumer of that news, but usually it's a feedback loop. People share stories with you that they see, and it's your friend, and you may not get a balanced view of what's really happening in the world, and we're all subjected to that. So in fact, I met also in Latvia a group of journalists who are working on an institute. How do they work to educate consumers how to be critical consumers of news? How do you actually try to validate what you're reading? How do you check sources? It's not an easy thing to do, but that's one of the ways in which the folks in Latvia want to push back against fake news, because they're bombarded by this stuff constantly.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to switch gears and bring us back here to Michigan, and something that I know that you and you talked about this earlier. It's a bipartisan issue with people as divergent as Congressman Kaptur to Congressman Huizenga, and that's stopping Asian carp. And it's really about a study that the Corps of Engineers have done. It hasn't been released. Tell me what that is in the moments we have.
Yeah, we're frustrated on a bipartisan basis across the Great Lakes, because Asian carp is an incredible threat to the Great Lakes that we have to stop. The Army Corps of Engineers is engaged in operations right now to prevent that from happening as they're coming up through Illinois and the river systems. But they've done a very detailed study as to how to make a more robust barrier. The study was ready in the winter. It's been stopped by the Trump administration. They have not released it. We are asking for it to be released. So the legislation is very clear. When we pass this legislation, the Army Corps of Engineers must release this study so that we can move forward with it.
Why in the heck would the administration be holding up this report?
We don't really know, and we've asked the question of the administration. They're saying they don't have somebody that they've appointed in that position in the Army Corps of Engineers to review the study. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This has gone through a very, very vigorous process. It's a normal process for the Army Corps. I don't know why you need a political appointee to sign off on the study. It should just be released.
And this is separate from, but it is linked to the overall health of the Great Lakes. The $300 million I know that was rolled back, put back in, and may be withheld from the next budget for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, the Asian carp issue. These all become fundamental to the economic well-being of the Great Lakes region, because so much of the commerce does depend on those lakes.
Absolutely. So we are laser focused on making sure those resources continue to come. Unfortunately, the Trump administration budget does zero out funding for Great Lakes restoration. It zeroes out funding for a number of other environmental programs that are important. Also, I'm concerned about funding for the U.S. Coast Guard, which has a big presence here in the Great Lakes. So, but I believe we'll be able to be successful in keeping that funding there, because we've been able to come together on a bipartisan basis. When it comes to Great Lakes, when it comes to the Great Lakes Restoration Fund, for example, you won't find daylight between Republican and Democratic members of the Michigan congressional delegation. We are all together. In fact, just this week we had a delegation meeting in Washington where we come together in the morning, bipartisan, both the Senate and the House, talk about issues. And the number one issue on our agenda was the Great Lakes, as it always is.
Our thanks to Senator Peters, and we'll be back with more To the Point. Also this week in Lansing, there was some activity. There is a new budget deal. The House and Senate have voted it out. It's now on the governor's desk. And in the coming weeks, we'll be talking to at least two people who either are or may be running for governor. That's just some of what's coming when you join us every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock here on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.